Hello, Bob Wells here, and welcome to another episode of the Undercurrent Stories podcast, where we dive deep into the hidden depths of our world, one fascinating guest at a time. What does it mean when we say that language is always changing? And why does that change so often make us uneasy? Today on Undercurrent Stories, we explore the living, shifting nature of English, from the rise of the new pronouns to the supposed decline of grammar. From Chaucer's Middle English to the language of social media, English has never stood still. Yet debates about what's correct or improper continue to shape education, identity and belonging. We'll consider how English has evolved, who gets to decide what counts as standard, and why the story of language is in many ways the story of us all. So joining me to discuss this is Professor Curzan, linguist, author and one of the leading voices on how language both reflects and reshapes the world we live in. Hello, welcome to Undercurrent Stories, Anne.
Thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to be here.
It's great to have you on. And I think, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, it'll be interesting to see the similarities between English and American usage of English. And I have to say, listening to your book, it's a great book. I've learned two new words already, wordie and grammando.
Oh, I'm so glad that those words have stuck with you. They are two of my favorite words in the book. And as you saw, a theme in the book. And when I started the book, I thought that I was writing to grammandos. And grammando is a word that I discovered from Lizzie Skernick in the New York Times Sunday magazine. She has this wonderful little segment that's called That Should Be a Word. And in 2012, it was grammando. And she defined it as someone who is constantly correcting other people's language. And I would guess you and I both know people who have that tendency. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write this book to grammandos to help them become more aware of language change and more accepting of diversity and change in language. And as I was writing the book, I realized that actually every single one of us has a little grammando inside of us and a little wordie. And wordie, relatively new word, W-O-R-D-I-E, like a foodie, but for words. And so someone who loves words. And that what I'm trying to do is help our inner grammando and our inner wordie have a more informed conversation inside our head so we can decide what might come out our mouth when we hear, for example, something that we don't like happening in the language or something that's unfamiliar. And so I'm very honest, as you saw in the book, that I have a little inner grammando who sometimes gets cranky about things, and then I have conversations with it.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think we all do. And I think some people are probably more, shall we say, vociferous in their views and perhaps don't make many friends when they do that. But first of all, before we sort of start talking about the book and English language, please could you tell us a bit about yourself, your life's journey, and what made you decide to, study the English language and become a linguist, please?
Oh, thank you for the question. And it's a story that I tell undergraduates at the University of Michigan often because I started college as a math major. I was a very mathy kid, was good at math. I was also interested in languages, but I honestly, when I went to college, did not know what linguistics was, except that it clearly was related to languages. And I took an introductory course my first year in college. And then my second year in college, I took a course on the history of the English language with a remarkable faculty member named Marie Boroff. And it changed my life. I had no idea that I could study how English had come to be the way it is. I wanted to know everything that she knew. I'm still working on that. But I changed my major to linguistics. And I have been studying the history of English with, a few little detours, but studying the history of English ever since.
Well, that's an interesting story. And I will start off with the American thing because it's quite topical. There was something out in one of our newspapers the other day saying about how a lot of the younger children in the UK are now using a lot of Americanisms in their language. And, one or two teachers have heard the word trash rather than rubbish, candy rather than sweets. And I wondered had you heard that in the States at all, that's what seems to be happening over here?
Well, I have certainly heard that. And then I also hear about the Britishisms that are finding their way over here. And Ben Yagoda has a book called Gobsmacked, and he also has a blog about not one-off Britishisms. We absolutely are seeing American English words finding their way into British youth culture. We are also finding British terms making their way over here. I will say, over the last 6 months, a year, I suddenly use the word bonkers all the time.
And that was, you see that as an English word, do you, Anne?
It does seem to be, in terms of where it was popular first and where it has traveled, that has traveled along with gobsmacked.
Yes.
And then smaller things like American English is now starting to move towards with an S,
towards,
which is a British form, as opposed to toward without an S. So it seems to be two-way traffic.
Well, I'm pleased about that.
On this one.
Being a Brit. And in my lifetime, there's been, certainly over the last 20 years, quite a few changes. So let me just say, I'm probably still a bit old school on this, and I'll carry on talking as I always used to do. But, in the old days, you'd say hello to somebody, then it became hi, and now it's hey. Which seems to have come from your country. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying how it's changed. And one that I have to say, I'm a bit of a grammando on this one. You hear people going, "Oh, can I get a coffee?" rather than "Please, can I have a cup of coffee?" And I feel like saying, "Yeah, just go around the back and help yourself,"
And I appreciate your own awareness of the things that you're noticing and the fact that what you're seeing is change in the language, some of which we notice, some of which we don't. And to think about, what am I going to do with the fact that I don't like this? And one of the things that I hear about here in the States is went missing. That someone went missing or has gone missing, which is seen as very British, but it is taken off in American English usage, and it is making some Americans very cranky. And my reaction is, this is change in progress. You can opt out. You can decide, I don't want to use that form, but it's happening. And often, and I think this was implied in what you were saying, it's young people, they're the movers and shakers of language change. Yeah. As one of my linguist friends likes to call it, movers and shakers. They are not the only originators of language change, but it is often young people. And young people get criticized for all kinds of things, including that they are decaying, a source of decay in the language and destroying it. But one of the things I love about studying the history of English is that I study all the changes in English. I also study the history of people worrying about and complaining about the changes in English, which gives you a very different perspective when you go back and you see in the 1800s, Richard Grant White saying, the verb donate is just an abomination because it was new and it had been backformed. You had the noun donation. And once you have that noun, well, what happens to have a donation happen? Well, people must donate things. And so people created the verb donate. And Richard Grant White, that was a terrible development in the language and was complaining about it. And now we look at it and think, how quaint that he was worried about that. And I think whatever it is that I don't like or that people around me are worried about, this will also probably seem quaint in 50 or 100 years.
Because it's continually evolving.
It is continually evolving, which doesn't mean, and I always want to be specific here. Sometimes people will hear me and they will say, well, Anne Curzan clearly has no standards about anything. And that's not actually the case. What I would like us to focus on is clarity and rhetorical effectiveness and context and audience to say, it helps to know if some people might get cranky about a particular form, particularly in formal writing. It doesn't mean that it's wrong, quote unquote.
Yeah.
It means it might be new.
Yes.
And as a writer or a speaker, you can then make informed choices about, do I want to be more conservative here? Or am I willing to use the new innovative form and risk some people being cranky? Then you're making informed choices, but it's not with the idea that this one's right and this one's wrong. You get to decide, what kind of effect do I want to have with this particular audience?
And the other thing I was going to talk to you about, and I will get off my grammando soapbox, because I'm not really, I'm quite creative in my thoughts about words, but you'll hear somebody talk about something that has happened in the past, but they'll talk as though it's in the present. That seems to be almost like a new phenomenon. Have you noticed that?
I certainly do notice it. I don't think it's all that new. It is a way to make the past seem more active and more dramatic. Yes. And so you will see this in narratives, written narratives, and you will hear it in speech, that when we are retelling something, it may start in the past, that we'll say, well, this happened. And then you start to hear the tense move into the present of, and she says this, and I walk over there, and then he says that. And suddenly we've moved into the present as we relive this moment in the past. And sometimes it makes for really good storytelling.
Are there any rules of language that you think we really should let go now?
Well, let me differentiate between a couple of kinds of rules. There are all of the patterns, what linguists would call descriptive rules, that we follow as speakers and writers of English without thinking about them as rules. And those we really can't get rid of. They might change, but it's how we all communicate with each other. And some of them are so basic, we don't even think about them as rules. But just to give you one example, the determiner, such as the, comes before the noun. So we would say the book or the podcast, and not podcast the or dog the. It doesn't feel like a rule, but it is actually a descriptive rule for how English works. And that one we're stuck with, at least for the moment. Then there are what linguists would call prescriptive rules, these rules that have been imposed onto the language to say this is a better way to use the language, or a more formal way, the correct way. And absolutely, there are a few of these that don't seem to serve a particularly good purpose. We could take, for example, the rule about ending a sentence with a preposition. And that rule, which has been imposed for 250, 300 years, started as a preference where we had someone who said, I think it is more elegant if you don't strand the preposition. So something like, that is the book I was referring to. There, that to, a preposition, is sitting at the end of the sentence. English can do that. I will sometimes hear people say, well, you can't strand a preposition at the end of a sentence. And I think, well, you certainly can. English grammar allows you to do it. And the rule that was developed and then enforced in grammar books, and I certainly grew up with it, was you should not have that preposition at the end. So what you end up with is, that is the book to which I was referring. Now, how do you feel about that sentence?
Well, I understand what it is. That is the book to which I was referring.
How's the tone?
Possibly.
That's the book to which I was referring.
Maybe a little curt, perhaps.
A little curt. For me, it feels very formal. Yeah. Maybe a little uptight about grammar. So again, it's not wrong. It's not wrong to say that's the book to which I was referring, but it can sound overly formal in a lot of contexts, including in writing. And there is actually no good reason why you can't say that's the book I was referring to. It is perfectly grammatical in the English language. Another example would be splitting infinitives. So one of the most famous ones from Star Trek, to boldly go. So you have the infinitive to go, you stick the adverb boldly right into the middle of it. Now, in Latin, you cannot do that because in Latin, the infinitive is one word. That is actually true in many languages, including Old English, where it was one word. But in English, modern English, the infinitive is two words, to go, to walk, to talk. And so we can take an adverb or an adverbial phrase and stick it between the to and the verb. And sometimes it sounds better. It sounds better rhythmically. It sounds better to get the adverb right next to the verb. I think about the expression to better serve. I think that expression works very well. It's a split infinitive.
And how do you think, I've got two questions really, but they're linked on the same theme of pace and change. So what are your thoughts on how the education system, particularly with junior schools, we call them junior and primary over here, the younger kids, they are taught certain rules about grammar. And I would guess that I'm not sure that they can keep pace with change such as that. And also dictionaries. I was interested to read or hear about your view on dictionaries in terms of really the dictionary's there to keep pace with the language and the evolve rather than setting the scene about what the words are. So I know there's two very different questions there, but I was wondering if you could just discuss both of them, please.
Oh, I am delighted. I'll start with dictionaries, which are just one of my favorite topics, and then we'll go to education, also a favorite. Dictionaries are so much more interesting than people realize. And often when I'm teaching at the University of Michigan, I have on my syllabus a week or two on dictionaries, and the students at the beginning of the term will say, "What? We're going to spend that much time on dictionaries? How boring." And by the end of it, they are completely fascinated because dictionaries are a very human product. And I'm always struck by the phrase, the dictionary, when people will say, go look it up in the dictionary, as if all dictionaries are exactly the same, which they are not. Oxford dictionaries are quite different from Merriam-Webster, from Random House, from Collins. They have different philosophies. They have different editors. You should certainly look, if you're using a paper version, which I know many people do not now. When was that thing published? Yeah. How recent is it? Is it unabridged? Is it collegiate? All these different dictionaries. And then what dictionary editors will say, which I think is a surprise to many people, they will say, we are just trying to keep up with all of you. You all are changing the language. We are watching you, particularly our writing, because that's easier to track. So they're looking at all kinds of publications, magazines, newspapers, books, now social media, trying to see how the language is changing. And then they're trying to figure out which changes will stick. Because sometimes, especially with slang, sometimes with jargon, you'll get a new word. It's really just a blip on the radar of language, and it doesn't last very long. And historically, dictionary editors have tended not to put those into dictionaries. But once they see that it's got some staying power, they're seeing it in different kinds of publications, that word would find its way into dictionaries. So it's relevant also when people will say to me something like, the compound brain rot, and they'll say, is that a word? Is that a real word? And what they mean is, has that found its way into dictionaries yet? Or when YOLO, you only live once, first came on the scene, is that a real word? And my answer was, if you know what it means, it's a real word. And it may take a little time to find its way into dictionaries, but it's a real word if we're using it and it's meaningful. So that's a way to think about dictionaries. They, of course, are changing quite quickly now that they're online because, first of all, they can be updated much more rapidly than they could when they had to wait for a new edition. And second, and this one's really interesting, they no longer have page constraints.
No. In terms of the volume of words, I guess.
Yeah. So when you think about paper dictionaries, the hardcover ones that I grew up with, if they were going to put in all the new words, either the dictionary just got longer and longer and longer, or they needed to take out words in order to put in new words. And those are really hard decisions about when does a word come out of a dictionary.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, you've worked on dictionaries. Do you take words out? And what rationale do you use?
Yeah, so the decision to take words out is a very difficult one. I have actually never served as a dictionary editor. I have been on the usage panel for the American Heritage Dictionaries, but I talk often with dictionary editors, and those are hard choices because they're looking at words, particularly words that are now obsolete, for example, for a technology that is no longer something that we use. But even then, they know, and you and I know, that that word is probably going to show up in a novel that we're reading.
Yes.
From that period of time. And then we're going to say, what is that thing? And then we're going to want to go to a dictionary and look it up and hope that it's there. And you often see in dictionaries words, and then next to it, you have obsolete or archaic, but there's still a good chance that someone's going to want to go look it up. And that's where online dictionaries have the wonderful benefit of not being constrained by length. Now, you also asked about education.
Yeah, it's a big one.
And it's a really big one. And here I think there may be some British and American differences. So I will talk about what I would love to see. And I actually think parts of the British education system may be closer to this than we are here in the States. But what I'd love to see is that our schools approaching language the way we approach other subjects like chemistry or geology or math, where as students are going through school, we're teaching them a little bit of chemistry as they go, often starting simple and then it gets more complicated. We may not even call it chemistry early on. Language is so fundamental to us as humans. And what I'd love to see is that we start teaching it as a subject where students are learning about how does language change? Why do people sound different in Britain and in the United States? What is that accent difference? Where did it come from? Why do people in London speak differently from people in the north of England? How did that happen? You think about a word like, which young people use all the time, sometimes to mean to say or think. I was like, do you want to go to the movies? And he was like, sure. You can have a fascinating conversation with young people about all the ways that they use the word like. And suddenly you're talking about prepositions and conjunctions and nouns and verbs with a word that they're really interested in. Or how does slang work? How do you make new words? I would love to see our education system opening up language as something to study and understand how it works. And then as we go, we can start talking about, okay, let's talk about formal writing versus informal speech and how you might want to use the language differently in different contexts. But we've already been having conversations about just fundamentally, how does language work? Why does it change? Why does it vary across social groups and geographies? And that would be a really responsible thing to do to understand this part of being human that, at least when I was in school, I don't know about you, but I never studied it as a human phenomenon. No. I only studied it in terms of formal rules for writing.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. Yeah. But I can ask my wife.
So that's my
I could ask my wife. She's just come home. She's a primary school teacher. But she's the ultimate grammando.
And I'd love to hear her thoughts on it. And I think about what we were just talking about with dictionaries. We could be opening up dictionaries for conversation with quite young people of what does it mean? How does a word get into a dictionary? Let's talk about that. There's actually a wonderful children's book called Frindle, which is about a kid trying to get a new word into a dictionary. Where do new words come from? My experience is that young people are very curious about this. They like to play with language. And if we're willing to use something like slang, which I do in my own classrooms, they are engaged from the get-go.
Yeah.
So when I am teaching, when I start class, I ask the students to teach me one or two new slang words at the beginning of every class period. So I learn all these great slang words. And then I always have follow-up questions. So if it's a verb, I'll say, well, can it take an object? Is it transitive? What would the past tense be? And they're looking at me like this is such a funny conversation that I'm taking a slang word and I'm taking it apart, but they're interested. that whole room is engaged with me in that conversation.
I think children are very interesting. I've got grandchildren, and it's fascinating how they learn language and how understandably they get some of the things wrong. So I remember, they instead of he bited it. Instead of saying he bit it, he bited it, which actually, is logical, isn't it, with the way that a lot of words are formed?
It is absolutely logical. And here's a great little tidbit from the scholars who study children's language acquisition. And now you can often hear this with young people, is that with an irregular verb, so if we take something like bring, and the standard past tense is brought, and at first you'll hear the kid use brought, and then they'll figure out the rule for making past tense, which is to add ed. Yeah. And then they'll over-apply it, and they'll say bringed.
Yeah. Oh, bringed, yeah.
They'll say bringed, and then they will get corrected, or they'll hear and realize that bring is an exception, and they'll go back to brought. So you'll get brought, bringed, brought in their language acquisition
It's
pattern.
Interesting. And the other thing you're saying about made-up words by young children, my youngest daughter, we were in Portugal, and we went up to a place we were staying, and it was very, very hot. And the trees, there were olive trees and things like that. And she described the leaves as being very frispy, which I thought was a fantastic word. Frispy. You can see, can't you, a frazzled, dried up leaf in the sun. Frispy. It should go in the dictionary.
And you can hear it with the
crackling
and the like that what we would call a blend or a portmanteau word, where you take two words and put them into one. That is a lovely word.
Yeah. So when just on the dictionary side, when a word goes into the dictionary, could you just tell us the process of how that actually works?
Well, again, I want to be clear. I'm speaking secondhand from all of the dictionary editors that I know and I'm friends with. No, it's absolutely fine, because it's a great question. So they are tracking these words. There is not any one determinative factor of when a word will get in and when it won't. They will say it's things like frequency, so watching for increases in frequency, which we can now do so much more easily than people could 50 years ago. Now dictionary editors are watching these big databases of text where we can search all of these newspapers online and magazines and the web. So they're getting much more accurate frequency pictures, so they can track the rise and then potentially the decline of a word. They can also track how it's spreading. So is it spreading? Did it start in a fairly niche place? Was this a weightlifting word? Was this a pop music? Was this a meme? And then suddenly we're seeing it in The Guardian, and we're seeing it in the Washington Post. And so they're trying to see how it spreads. And then at some point, when it looks like this has staying power, it will go into a dictionary. You will see, especially with newer words, if you check multiple dictionaries, it often will be in one and not in another. So it will get in at different paces in different dictionaries. And then there's another very interesting question, which is, should it have a label? Now, when I was growing up, I never really noticed the labels, but most dictionaries have a system of labels that include things like slang, colloquial, informal, slang, vulgar, offensive, vulgar slang. And so again, an exercise that I will do sometimes with students is take words that maybe should have a usage label, and I will give them the definitions and make them decide if it should have a usage label or not. And suddenly they're like, wait, what's the difference between vulgar and vulgar slang, between informal and colloquial? And they often disagree with the decisions that editors have made. But we can also understand why editors want to do this. They would say, we're just trying to describe the language. We're not trying to tell you what is good or bad. But part of telling you how the language works is if this word has a slangy feel to it, then, YOLO it would be irresponsible not to say that if we imagine second language learners or foreign language learners who are trying to understand how is a word used. Well, they want to know, is that a slangy word? And certainly they want to know, is that an offensive word? Mm-hmm. Because certainly when I'm speaking languages that are not my first language, I need to know whether that is a word that is going to cause damage, because I won't have intuitions about that.
And with the increase, particularly with young people, it's been around a while now, but with the increase in texting and emojis, I guess I would make the assumption that the volume of communication has sort of reduced from verbal language and written language to text and emojis. So you've got another form of communication that sort of absorbs some of the language. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm fascinated by texting. I am a better texter because I hang out with young people and they have taught me a lot about texting. As you note, texting is the written language being used in a way that we have not seen before. It's a lot like speech in that it is moving very fast. It is almost a dialogue if you've got two people on their phones at the same time, going back and forth very fast. However, it is also missing many of the things we have when we are speaking. Tone, if we're in the same place, facial expression, hand gestures. So we, when we're speaking, have all these ways to communicate to someone else. I'm joking right now. I'm serious. I'm being playful. That's a question. And what we've seen young people do is repurpose punctuation and to use emojis to do the work of tone and facial expression and hand gestures. So I learned from students, which I had not known, but it has completely changed the way I text, that the period at the end of a text is angry. And once you know that, it's hard to see the period the same way again.
That's the full stop.
The full stop. For you all, the full stop. So if you have a text that says something like, okay, full stop, that is serious and potentially angry. Yes.
Right. I better stop doing that.
At least here in the US.
Yeah. Well, it's probably the same here.
Here in the US, it is angry. So the neutral thing would be to say, okay, with no punctuation at all. That would be neutral. If you put an exclamation mark, probably 2 would be better. That shows some enthusiasm. Okay, ... shows skepticism, or I'm waiting for more information. Young people do know that people, for example, my age, who are a bit older, do not understand the punctuation rules. And so they will try to accommodate the fact that we don't know that the full stop at the end of a text is angry. But they'll say, sometimes I just get a little thrown because my mom will text me and she'll say something like, I'll see you at 7, full stop. And I'll think, why is she so mad at me? And then I'll remember it's my mom and she doesn't know that the full stop is angry. But I think for people who are a little bit older, we can say, oh, young people don't know how to use punctuation and it's chaos and they don't care. And my point is actually they care a lot and they have developed a different system for punctuation that is doing the work that it needs to do in texting. And it opens up this educational space for me as a teacher where I can say, okay, you all teach me about the intricacies of this system that you've developed. And they teach me the difference between a crying face and a smiling face and a winky face and all these things that I did not fully understand all the nuances. And then I can say, this is so helpful. It is making me a better texter. And I happen to have spent much of my life learning this academic system of punctuation. Yes. And I am happy to share that knowledge with you so that you can be really good at that game of academic writing. And you have made me better at the game of texting. And you can see that that immediately moves us out of this idea that there's one right way to use punctuation. There's a formal academic way to use punctuation. There's a texting way to use punctuation. And that's I think a much more fun and also accurate way to teach.
So that's something that sort of added to your armory of being a linguist, really, isn't it? All that.
All of this, yes, has absolutely happened in my lifetime as a linguist. And that's why I hope that all of us can be more curious than judgy as we see new things. Because it's fascinating to watch the way the language changes. It is also true that when the telegraph was invented, there were people that were worried that we were all going to start talking like telegraphs and telegrams. And so to recognize it's natural, I think, to worry about change as humans. We often see new things and worry about them. The same is true of language. But I hope that we can adopt the mindset of a bird watcher or a birder. And that's something that I came up with again as I was writing the book. But I thought, when a bird watcher sees a new or an unfamiliar bird, they have lots of questions, right? They watch it. How does it fly? What does it look like? What does it eat? How does it sleep? Where does it go? They don't say, kill it. Yeah. And yet sometimes when we see or hear new language, we say, make it stop. I don't like that, make it stop. And what I hope we can do is adopt that bird watcher mindset and say, what's going on there? How are people using that word or that construction? Is that new, or is that from a different region or a different social group that I'm not familiar with? And try to learn about it as opposed to trying to kill it.
I think that I can see that, and there. I mean, I do quite a bit of reading, and I enjoy reading words. And so, like you said earlier on, I wouldn't necessarily look at a dictionary, but I will quickly go into Google and take a couple of ideas as to what it is. But I sometimes get accused by those very close to me of overusing a certain word during a period of time because I'm quite enthused by it. So one of the latest ones, and I think this is a good example of a word that sums up something, is zeitgeist, because it means so much, but not everybody understands it. And I'm not being snobby or snooty about it, but it's a great description of a particular time and the feeling at the time, So I'm very interested in words that really have a lot of meaning to them and can be summed up in that one word, a bit like all the different types of snow that Inuits would have used for we just see it snow, but there's so many different types and they have a different name for it. I find that really fascinating.
Oh, I think there are so many wonderful words. And I, again, really appreciate your awareness of your own way where you may have a word and for a while it's a word that's feeling very descriptive.
Stop using
for you. And I think sometimes we can get those where it's just a personal word that is sort of tip of tongue for us at that moment. We will also see that happen more broadly. And my colleague John McWhorter at Columbia has made the analogy that language can work a lot like fashion in clothing. And so suddenly everyone is wearing, big flannel shirts. And I didn't have big flannel shirts, but before I know it, I've sort of seen it everywhere. And then I find myself buying a big flannel shirt. And now I'm wearing big flannel shirts because it's sort of in the water. You're seeing it all around you. And the same thing can happen with language, is that a word just gets a kind of momentum. It becomes fashionable. And then slowly it stops being fashionable and another word becomes fashionable or another idiom. And I remember this was maybe 5 or 10 years ago. It is what it is. Was an idiom that we were hearing a lot, at least here on this side of the pond. And at the end of the day, we were getting a lot of at the end of the day. And I have noticed that one of the words that I am using a lot is the intensifier super.
The intensifier super.
As in, that's super interesting.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I was super excited about it.
Well, that's a bit like thank you so much, isn't it? That seems to have come in. It used to be thank you or thank you very much. Now it's thank you so much.
Well, and this is something we see with intensifiers. because once an intensifier would be something like very or truly or really or so. And once it becomes, so very used to mean in truth. We can see that root of true in the root of very, in the same way that truly did. And then once we start to use very as an intensifier, very interesting, it loses some of its strength. And so then very interesting doesn't seem quite interesting enough. And so we're like, it's really interesting. And then really starts to lose its strength. And then we're like, it's so interesting. And then so isn't strong enough. And at the moment, I seem to have now gone toward super. It's super interesting. And I'm not alone. People are tracking this, and it seems to be a fashionable intensifier at this moment. And then it will get replaced by something else.
Very interesting. There's some words which are probably above fashion because they're used now in their true sense that probably 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, people wouldn't have even thought of them. I'm thinking of the word algorithm, which is used by us. Everybody uses that word at some point. I mean, it's, people would have known about it years ago, but probably most people might have heard it but never used it. That's an interesting one.
It is an interesting one. I agree. So a specialized term that certainly many of us had encountered, but now I agree with you. We talk about algorithms in everyday life because they are part of so many of our everyday lives in terms of the way they shape what we are seeing and hearing. And that there we're seeing the influence of technology, which has had an enormous impact on language. It's one of the things that dictionary makers also now track because they can in terms of frequency of lookups in online dictionaries and frequency of use. Yes. We're hitting the season where the words of the year vote starts happening. And dictionary.com has already put out their word of the year. Oxford will put out a word of the year. Merriam-Webster will do it. Collins will do it. The tradition actually started with the American Dialect Society that I've been a member of for a long time, started in 1990 of a new word or, and this is where your point is an important one, a newly prominent word. So sometimes it'll be a brand new word. I remember in 2000, the word of the year was Y2K. Because we were all paying attention to what was going to happen with the turn of the millennium. And that was a relatively new coinage. But sometimes it will be a word that has just suddenly become prominent, like here in the US, bailout, when we had the recession and we had subprime and bailout being these newly prominent words. They weren't new, but we weren't all talking about subprime before suddenly it was everywhere.
Credit crunch was another one, wasn't it? Credit crunch.
Yep.
Pronouns. Obviously, we now live in an age where a female actor a female actress is now an actor. People refer to themselves as they and them. How successful do you think all that has been, and what effect has it had? Do you think?
The question about success here is, to me, a very interesting one, or a super interesting one, I suppose I could say, because consciously imposing or asking people to change their language is often not successful. That when you say to people, and we see this with, for example, the Académie Française, which will try to get people to stop using an American English borrowing, and often is not entirely successful in that. So when you had the effort starting really in the 1970s to address some of these words that people saw as sexist, where people's sense was that an actress was not taken as seriously, or we can think about something like an authoress.
Yeah.
And people said, I don't want to be an authoress. Women said, I want to be an author, not an authoress. And so there was a move toward gender neutral language. And we certainly also saw this with the use of the pronoun he as a generic. And I'm old enough that certainly when I was in school, well into college, I was taught that for a gender neutral human being, I should use he. So it would be a sentence like, a teacher should learn his students' names. And I will say that I did not feel included in that sentence. A teacher should learn his students' names because he is not my pronoun. But I was taught that that was correct. And then there was a real push with second wave feminism to move toward either he or she or singular they, to not have that kind of bias toward men in the language. And so we saw it both with gender neutral terms and with pronouns. It has been strikingly successful, which I think what you're seeing here is a cultural movement that aligned with a linguistic reform movement. And it was that you had these happening pretty much simultaneously, that you could see that kind of language change. And now, if you look not only at writing, but also at speech, you will see, for example, here in the US, a firefighter as opposed to a fireman.
Yeah.
Like that is now completely standard usage.
Yes.
And one that I think is sort of shockingly successful, and you can tell me if in British English this is flight attendant.
Yeah, we have the same, yeah. Yeah, cabin crew, flight attendant.
Now,
yeah.
Cabin crew, flight attendant. Now, flight attendant is pretty clumsy when we think about it. It's a lot of syllables, but we now use that as the generic as opposed to a stewardess and maybe a steward. Flight attendant has worked. So we often went for a gender neutral term. It has been surprisingly successful. And then singular they also now has come to be accepted by a lot of style guides, both for gender neutral uses and for non-binary individuals. Now, that the second use, the non-binary pronoun, is relatively new. I had been studying the gender neutral use of they for decades and looking at all this guidance where people say you can't use singular they in a sentence like a teacher should learn their students' names. Well, if you look at how we actually use the language, we have been using they in that kind of construction for hundreds and hundreds of years. You can find it in Shakespeare. You can find it in Jane Austen. There's actually a whole website devoted to Jane Austen and singular they, which I did not write. Someone else did. And so then people would say to me, but Anne, they cannot be singular, which is a great argument. And I would say, but it is singular. And they would say, but it can't be singular. And I would say, but it is. If you listen to us talk, we say, here's another one. Someone who knows where they're going should give us directions. I think that just completely flies under the radar for most speakers. Someone who knows where they're going. Someone is singular. They is working as a singular pronoun. And then people would say to me, well, Anne, a pronoun can't be singular and plural at the same time, which is, of course, a fascinating argument to make about English, because in modern English, we already have a pronoun that is singular and plural at the same time, which is you. Mm-hmm. And we say you are for one person and you are for many people. English didn't always work that way. We used to have thou, which was singular, and you, that was plural. That changed, and you is both singular and plural. And for hundreds of years, they has been singular and plural. And so the real question was, can I write down singular generic they? And there is not a particularly good reason not to be able to do that. And now style guides have generally accepted it. Sometimes people will raise the counter argument, which I understand, that they can be ambiguous. And sometimes it can be. And they'll say, okay, let's take the sentence, my mother and her friend were in the yard and they said. Is that both of them said? Or does my mother's friend go by they?
Or doesn't it matter in the context of what they're saying, perhaps?
Or doesn't it matter? And my answer is, if we took that same sentence and said, my mother and her friend were in the yard and she said, it would also be ambiguous. Yes. Because maybe you have two women there and they both use she, and now I don't know which one said it. Pronouns can be ambiguous. And so you got to rework that sentence if it's ambiguous. And one of the things that pushed singular gender neutral they into style guides was non-binary they. That in order to be respectful of people whose pronoun is they, style guides shifted so that their writers could use they for people whose pronoun is they.
Yes. So what about things like me and John went to the restaurant rather than John and I went to the restaurant? How seriously wrong is that?
Oh, goodness. You are hitting on a peeve, a place where a lot of people go grammando on these pronouns. And we have a couple of different constructions that people go grammando on. The one that you mentioned, me and my mom went to the store, which I think feels very colloquial to people. And then there is also the construction, well, between you and I, let me tell you. And people say, no, it should be between you and me. This confusion has also been going on for centuries. It typically happens in these conjoined constructions, X and Y. And what we're seeing is that we have the colloquial form, me and so. And so the colloquial would have that in both subject and object position. And then the formal would be my mother and I, both in subject and in object position, which is how you get between you and I, between my mother and I. And then you have what is still seen as the standard, which makes a distinction between subject position and object position, where you would get my mother and I in subject position and my mother and me in object position. What we're seeing is a long-term change in progress. It's going to take generations, and I don't quite know how it's going to play out. But the bigger picture, I say as a historian of the language, is that we are seeing the collapse of subject and object in the pronouns.
That's interesting.
So we are. And here's the really interesting fact, which is if you go back to Old English, the time of Beowulf, 1,000 years ago, all nouns distinguish between subject and object. So whether it was a dog or a book or a rose or a podcast, it would have a different form if it was in subject position or object position. In other words, English had case, like Latin and many, many other languages. It is a Germanic language. And it lost that case system. So now a rose is a rose is a rose, a podcast is a podcast, doesn't matter where it is in a sentence. But the pronouns have held on to that case system where we have a subject and an object. So we have I, me, he, him, she, her, they, them, we, us, but think about the pronoun you.
You.
Subject you, object you. And actually it used to be that the subject pronoun was ye and the object pronoun was you.
That's interesting.
And nobody ever told me this when I was reading Shakespeare in high school and college. Yeah. But if you go back and look at Shakespeare, he actually cannot keep his ye's and his you's straight. He's using both of them as subjects and objects because he's living through this change. Yes. And so we're living through this really big change in English, but it's going to take a long time for us to see that. And where we're seeing the confusion now is these conjoined X and Y constructions.
And I'm conscious of your time, so I'll probably there's so much we could talk about, but,
I know. And you ask great questions.
2 very quick questions.
Yeah.
Your study on linguistics, and you mentioned there about Beowulf and Old English, you must have spent some time going through Old English. Could you just tell us a bit about that, please?
I did. I have studied Old English, which I had to learn as a language. Studied it in graduate school. It is fascinatingly different from modern English. And when I recite the first lines of Beowulf, What we gardena and yar dagum theod kuninga thrum yafrunen, people are like, that's English? And you just heard me use like as a quotative there because I do that. It's in part of my grammar. So Old English was grammatically quite different. It had case. It also had grammatical gender. So all nouns were masculine, feminine, or neuter. We lost that system as well. And the vocabulary, it already had borrowings in it from Latin and from Old Norse. By the way, the pronouns they, them, and their are borrowed from Old Norse,
Oh, right.
which is very unusual. But it had not yet seen the huge influx of French borrowings that we get after 1066 and the Norman Conquest, where we get an infusion of French borrowings throughout words for government and law and fashion and food and all over the place. And then, of course, in the Renaissance, we get an enormous amount of borrowing from Latin, Italian, Greek, French, Arabic, where people are trying to enhance the language so it can be used for scientific writing and other kinds of technical writing. So Old English, much more Germanic vocabulary than we have in modern day.
So with the study that you've done, I mean, if somebody from, let's say somebody from 1,000 years ago spoke to you, you with your knowledge, you could sort of understand it quite easily.
Well, I hope so. I don't actually encounter spoken Old English ever. So I'm much better with it on the page. If they texted me, I think if they texted me in Old English, I would do much better.
Yeah. But you could respond in Old English.
I could.
Do you think so? Two more little mini questions and then one bonus question. Do you think that over the last, in recent history, that the evolution of our language, the English language, has increased in speed since, say, in other words, 100 years ago to 50 years and 50 years to now? Is it changing more and more and more, do you think?
This is a question that linguists are trying to figure out, and you will see different arguments about whether change is speeding up. We know that language contact can speed up language change. And so anytime you have periods of intense language contact, and English had those back when the Vikings were invading and the Norman Conquest, you will see pretty rapid language change. The internet is allowing all kinds of language contact that we've never seen before. It is also letting words spread across the globe in seconds. And we've never seen anything like that. But what we don't know is, will that be lasting change, or are those really fashionable blips? What are all the algorithms, as you know, going to do as they can make something more popular just through the way the algorithms work? So this is a pretty open question about, in different communities for different speakers, how is technology going to affect the speed of language change?
Well, thank you for that. And one question I've got is, if you've got anybody listening who, has enjoyed the conversation and wants to find out more and perhaps wants to not necessarily become an expert on the English language, but wants to widen their vocabulary with some of those words that aren't used as much, what would you suggest to them?
So to expand their vocabulary, I mean, one of the books that came to mind, and I want to make sure I get the title right, but it's by David Crystal, and it's something like The History of English in 100 Words.
Yes.
And it's a lovely way to think about the history of English through words.
So you can recommend that book?
Yeah.
And your book, tell us about your book. I mean, I say your book, you've got more than one book, but your latest book.
Well, I would be delighted if people, so my latest book is called Says Who, A Kinder, Funner Usage Guide for Everyone Who Cares About Words. And I'm opening up all the kinds of questions that we've talked about here, where the chapters are organized around a usage issue or maybe a rule that you may have learned in school. There is a chapter called The Funnest Chapter. There are chapters about pronouns. There are chapters about punctuation. And it's taking that usage issue and looking at the history of it. How did we get here? Where does this come from? And I hope, and what people have told me is that it is playful.
Yes.
I love language, as you can probably tell, and I tried to capture that in the book so that your inner wordie can just delight in the language.
Well, I can thoroughly recommend the book. I'm currently listening to it on Spotify, and I think the good thing about it is that it's you mentioned there about the enthusiasm. It's yourself, Anne, who's actually reading it. So I think that helps.
It is.
Yes.
Oh, I'm so glad you're enjoying it. I loved reading it, and I actually couldn't imagine, because as you now know, I'm telling stories about not only my students, but also, for example, my mother, who often went grammando on me and my sisters. And I couldn't imagine anyone else telling those stories. So I thought, of course, I'm going to read the book.
Well, Anne, this has been a really fascinating conversation. It's been really interesting to learn more about how language has evolved and continues to evolve, and how we should manage our inner wordie and grammando. My guest today has been Professor Anne Curzan. Anne is an award-winning scholar and teacher, an expert on the history of the English language, an author, and you can find links to her latest book, Says Who, together with her courses on the show notes. Thank you for coming on the show, Anne.
Thank you for such terrific questions and conversation.